In a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of town, Mr. Chen had lived alone in his modest two-story house for the past 15 years. At 78, his daily routine had become as predictable as the sunset, a morning walk to the local park, afternoon gardening in his small backyard, and evenings spent watching old movies while eating microwave dinners. His birthday approached as autumn painted the trees in brilliant shades of orange and red. Like the previous years, he expected it to pass without celebration. His wife had passed away years ago, and his children lived across the country, too busy with their own lives to visit more than once a year during Christmas. One chilly evening, just 2 days before his birthday, Mr. Chen noticed a small figure standing by his garden fence. It was little Amy Zhang, the 8-year-old girl who had recently moved in next door with her mother. She often waved to him while playing in her yard, but they had never really spoken. "Mr. Chen," her tiny voice carried across the yard. "Mom says you're always alone. Do you have anyone to celebrate your birthday with?" The old man's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected anyone to know about his birthday, let alone ask about it. "How did you know it's my birthday soon?" he asked, genuinely surprised. "I heard Mom talking on the phone about it with Mrs. Lee from the grocery store," Amy replied, her innocent honesty making Mr. Chen smile for the first time in days. "She said you buy a birthday cake every year and eat it alone." Mr. Chen felt a warmth spread through his chest, touched by the child's concern. "Well, yes, I suppose I do," he admitted, his voice slightly shaky. "My family lives far away, you see." Amy's face lit up with an idea. "Can I join you? Mom makes the best dumplings, and she always says food tastes better when shared." The enthusiasm in her voice was contagious, but Mr. Chen hesitated. It had been so long since he'd shared a meal with anyone. "I don't know if your mother would approve," he said carefully, but Amy was already running back to her house, pigtails bouncing with each step. That evening, Mr. Chen received an unexpected call from Amy's mother, Mrs. Zhang. She apologized for her daughter's forwardness but asked if they could join him for his birthday dinner. "Amy hasn't stopped talking about it," she explained. "And honestly, no one should eat alone on their birthday." The next day, Mr. Chen found himself cleaning his house for the first time in months, dusting off photo frames and arranging his living room furniture. He even pulled out his wife's old china set, which had remained untouched in the cabinet for years. As evening approached, his hands trembled slightly as he set the table. The doorbell rang precisely at 6, and there stood Amy, holding a large container of homemade dumplings, her mother beside her with a beautifully decorated birthday cake. As evening approached, his hands trembled slightly as he set the table. The doorbell rang precisely at 6, and there stood Amy, holding a large container of homemade dumplings, her mother beside her with a beautifully decorated birthday cake. The house that had been silent for so long suddenly filled with the sound of Amy's cheerful chatter, the clinking of plates, and genuine laughter. Mr. Chen found himself sharing stories about his younger days, about meeting his wife, and about the adventures they had together. What started as a simple dinner turned into an evening of connection and joy. Amy insisted on hearing every story behind the photos on his walls, and Mrs. Zhang shared her own experiences of moving to the neighborhood as a single mother. For the first time in years, Mr. Chen's birthday didn't feel like just another day. As they finished the cake, Amy proudly presented a handmade birthday card, covered in glitter and decorated with a drawing of Mr. Chen in his garden. "Now you're part of our family," she declared with the innocent conviction only a child could possess. Little did they know that this simple act of kindness would set in motion a series of events that would change all their lives forever. As Amy and her mother bid goodbye that evening, none of them could have anticipated the knock on the door that would come the very next day, or the remarkable journey it would begin. The morning after his birthday celebration, Mr. Chen woke up feeling lighter than he had in years. The house still held traces of yesterday's warmth, a few colorful balloons Amy had insisted on hanging, the birthday card propped proudly on his mantel, and the lingering aroma of Mrs. Zhang's dumplings. He was just about to start his morning routine when an authoritative knock echoed through his house. Opening the door, he found 2 police officers standing on his porch, their expressions serious but not unkind. Officer Rodriguez introduced herself and her partner, Officer Thompson, while Mr. Chen's mind raced, wondering if something was wrong. "Sir, we're here about a series of reports we've received," Officer Rodriguez began, her voice gentle but professional. Mr. Chen's heart sank, thinking perhaps the neighborhood had complained about his overgrown garden or late-night television watching. But what the officers said next left him speechless. "Several community members have reported concerns about your welfare," Officer Thompson explained. "Mrs. Lee from the grocery store, your next-door neighbor Mrs. Zhang, and even little Amy have all contacted us over the past few months, worried about your isolation." Mr. Chen learned that Mrs. Lee had noticed his increasingly irregular visits to her store, where he used to shop daily. Mrs. Zhang had observed him talking to his wife's photos through his kitchen window, and Amy had told her teacher about the lonely man next door who never has visitors. The officers weren't there to reprimand him, they were part of the community's elderly welfare program, a new initiative designed to support seniors living alone. They explained that the entire neighborhood had quietly been watching over him, concerned about his well-being but unsure how to help. "Your birthday dinner yesterday," Officer Rodriguez smiled, "was actually part of a larger community effort. Mrs. Zhang had been wanting to reach out for weeks, and Amy's innocent question about your birthday gave her the perfect opportunity." As they talked, more neighbors began appearing at his door. Mrs. Lee arrived with fresh vegetables from her store, explaining how she'd always set aside the best produce for him. Mr. Patel from the pharmacy came by with his wife, carrying homemade Indian sweets and offering to help organize Mr. Chen's medications. The officers shared that they had started a community support program, and Mr. Chen's neighbors had all volunteered to be part of his support network. They had created a schedule: someone would check on him daily, invite him for meals, or simply sit and chat. Overwhelmed by emotion, Mr. Chen sank into his armchair, tears welling in his eyes. All this time, while he thought he was invisible, an entire community had been silently watching over him, orchestrating ways to help him reconnect with the world. Amy, who had been watching from her window, came running over when she saw the police cars. Her mother followed closely behind, worried about the police presence. But upon seeing Mr. Chen's tears and the gathering of neighbors, Mrs. Zhang understood, their small act of kindness had sparked something much bigger. "See, Mr. Chen," Amy said, climbing onto the arm of his chair with the confidence of a child who knew she'd done something right. "I told you you're part of our family now. But I didn't know you were part of everyone's family." The officers stayed for a while, helping to organize a proper support system. They explained how their community program worked with local seniors, ensuring no elderly resident felt isolated or forgotten. Mr. Chen learned that his neighborhood was part of a pilot project, testing new ways to support aging community members. As the morning turned to afternoon, Mr. Chen's house had transformed from a quiet sanctuary of solitude into a bustling community hub. His dining room table, which just yesterday had hosted its first guests in years, was now surrounded by neighbors sharing stories, laughter, and plans for future gatherings. Mrs. Zhang took charge of organizing a weekly dinner rotation, while Mrs. Lee suggested starting a community garden in Mr. Chen's backyard, a place where he could share his gardening expertise with others. Mr. Patel offered to drive Mr. Chen to his doctor's appointments, and his wife promised to teach him some simple Indian recipes. The police officers left their contact information, not for emergencies, but as part of the community support network. They explained how this program had already helped dozens of seniors in other neighborhoods, creating stronger, more connected communities. As the impromptu gathering continued, Mr. Chen found himself sharing stories about his late wife, showing pictures of their travels, and for the first time in years, feeling truly heard. The walls of isolation he had built around himself were crumbling, replaced by the warm embrace of community support. That evening, as the last of his neighbors left, promising to return soon, Mr. Chen sat in his favorite chair, Amy's birthday card in his hands. What had started as a simple birthday dinner had unveiled a network of caring hearts that had been watching over him all along. Tomorrow would bring new visits, new conversations, and new reasons to smile. He was no longer just existing in his neighborhood, he was finally living in it. In the weeks following that surprising morning with the police officers, Mr. Chen's life transformed in ways he never could have imagined. His once quiet house became a hub of activity, and his calendar, which had gathered dust on his kitchen wall, was now filled with colorful markings indicating various community activities. Every Monday morning, he found himself teaching a small gardening class in his backyard. What started with Amy and 2 other neighborhood children had grown to include their parents and several seniors from nearby streets. His expertise with roses, gained from decades of tending to his late wife's garden, became legendary in the community. Mr. Chen called out little Amy one morning, her hands deep in the soil, "My rose bush has 5 new buds. Just like you said it would." Her excitement was contagious, and the other children gathered around to see. Mr. Chen felt a familiar warmth in his chest, the same feeling he used to get when teaching his own children about nature. Mrs. Zhang had kept her promise about the dinner rotation, but it had evolved into something more meaningful. Every Wednesday evening, different families would bring their signature dishes to share. Mr. Chen's dining room, which had been silent for so long, now echoed with laughter, stories, and the clinking of plates from various cultural traditions. During one such dinner, Mr. Patel's wife taught everyone how to make proper chai tea. The secret, she explained, demonstrating with Mr. Chen's kettle, is to let the spices dance with the tea leaves before adding the milk. The entire house filled with the aromatic scent of cardamom and cinnamon, creating new memories in rooms that had held onto old ones for too long. Officer Rodriguez and Officer Thompson became regular visitors, not just as part of their community program, but as friends. They brought updates about similar initiatives starting in other neighborhoods, often seeking Mr. Chen's advice on how to help other seniors open their doors to community support. "Your story has inspired changes in our approach," Officer Rodriguez shared one afternoon over tea. "We've learned that sometimes the smallest gestures, like a birthday dinner, can break down the strongest walls of isolation." The most significant change, however, came in Mr. Chen's relationship with technology. Mrs. Zhang noticed how he struggled to stay in touch with his children across the country, so she suggested teaching him to use video calls. Amy, being a child of the digital age, appointed herself as his personal technology tutor. "Look, Mr. Chen," she would say patiently, guiding his hands on the tablet screen, "just tap this green button, and you can see your grandchildren." After several amusing mishaps and countless practice sessions, Mr. Chen mastered the basics of video calling. His first successful video call with his daughter brought tears to everyone's eyes. "Dad," she said, her image clear on the screen, "you look so different, so happy." She could see the birthday card Amy had made him, still proudly displayed on the mantel behind him, and the fresh flowers from his garden brightening the room. The call led to a breakthrough in their relationship. His daughter, seeing how the community had embraced her father, realized she needed to be more present in his life. She started scheduling regular video calls, and for the first time in years, made plans to visit outside of the Christmas season. One morning, while tending to his roses, Mr. Chen found a small package on his doorstep. Inside was a leather-bound journal with a note from Officer Thompson, "For recording your gardening wisdom. The community center wants to start a similar program, and your experience could help others grow more than just flowers." Mr. Chen spent his evenings writing down everything he knew about gardening, but the pages filled with more than just plant care instructions. They captured the stories of transformation, how a simple garden could grow community bonds, how shared meals could nourish more than just bodies, and how caring for others could help heal one's own heart. The local newspaper got wind of the community's efforts and sent a reporter to interview Mr. Chen. Initially reluctant to be in the spotlight, he agreed when Amy pointed out that his story might help other lonely people find their way back to community life. The garden is just the beginning, he told the reporter, gesturing to the thriving backyard where children and adults work together. What we're really growing here is connection. The reporter noticed how the neighborhood children naturally gravitated toward Mr. Chen, seeking his approval for their planted seeds or asking questions about the butterflies visiting the flowers. As autumn turned to winter, Mr. Chen's house remained warm with activity. The garden classes moved indoors, where he taught everyone about caring for houseplants. The community gathered to help him digitize his wife's old recipes, creating a cookbook that blended her traditional dishes with new favorites from their weekly dinners. Each day brought new reasons to open his door, new chances to share his knowledge, and new opportunities to feel needed. The police officer's unexpected visit had unlocked not just a support system, but a second chance at living a life full of purpose and connection. The garden is just the beginning, he told the reporter, gesturing to the thriving backyard where children and adults work together. What we're really growing here is connection. The reporter noticed how the neighborhood children naturally gravitated toward Mr. Chen, seeking his approval for their planted seeds or asking questions about the butterflies visiting the flowers. As autumn turned to winter, Mr. Chen's house remained warm with activity. The garden classes moved indoors, where he taught everyone about caring for houseplants. The community gathered to help him digitize his wife's old recipes, creating a cookbook that blended her traditional dishes with new favorites from their weekly dinners. Each day brought new reasons to open his door, new chances to share his knowledge, and new opportunities to feel needed. The police officer's unexpected visit had unlocked not just a support system, but a second chance at living a life full of purpose and connection. As winter settled in, the newspaper article about Mr. Chen's community garden project caught the attention of the city council. One frosty morning, he received an official letter inviting him to speak at an upcoming council meeting about elderly community engagement. The thought of public speaking made his hands tremble, but Amy's unwavering confidence in him gave him courage. "You tell the best stories, Mr. Chen," she assured him while helping to arrange his indoor plants one afternoon. "Just pretend you're teaching us about roses, but instead, you're teaching them about how to make people happy." Her simple wisdom, as always, went straight to his heart. The day of the council meeting arrived with unexpected snowfall. Mr. Patel insisted on driving him to City Hall, and to Mr. Chen's surprise, several neighbors came along for support. As he walked into the impressive building, he felt Mrs. Zhang's reassuring hand on his shoulder and heard Amy's excited whispers echoing in the marble hallway. Standing at the podium, Mr. Chen forgot his prepared speech and instead spoke from his heart. He shared how a child's innocent question about a birthday dinner had cracked open the shell of his isolation. He described how the police officer's community program had transformed not just his life, but an entire neighborhood. "In my garden," he said, his voice growing stronger with each word, "we don't just grow flowers anymore. We grow friendships. We grow understanding. We grow community." He explained how the simple act of teaching children about plants had given him a new purpose, and how sharing meals with neighbors had filled not just his stomach, but his soul. The council members listened intently as he described the weekly dinners, the gardening classes, and the way technology had helped him reconnect with his family. When he finished speaking, the room erupted in applause. But what happened next surprised everyone. An elderly woman in the audience stood up, tears in her eyes. She introduced herself as Mrs. Robinson, a retired teacher living alone on the other side of the city. "I've been alone for 5 years since my husband passed," she said. "How can we start something like this in my neighborhood?" That question sparked a movement. The city council immediately proposed expanding the police department's community program citywide. They asked Mr. Chen to serve as an advisor, sharing his experience to help other neighborhoods create similar support networks. Back home that evening, exhausted but fulfilled, Mr. Chen found his living room filled with neighbors waiting to hear about the meeting. Amy sat cross-legged on the floor, carefully drawing what she called a victory poster, a colorful illustration of Mr. Chen speaking to the city council, complete with glitter and stars. "You're going to help other lonely people find friends," she declared, adding another star to her drawing. "Just like you found us." The simple truth in her words made everyone smile. The following weeks brought new challenges and opportunities. Mr. Chen began visiting other neighborhoods with officers Rodriguez and Thompson, sharing his story and helping other communities start their own programs. His daughter, watching his transformation through their regular video calls, decided to take extended leave from work to visit. When she arrived, she barely recognized her father's house. The once quiet rooms buzzed with energy. Children's artwork decorated the walls alongside old family photos. The kitchen shelves held labeled jars of tea from Mr. Patel, homemade pickles from Mrs. Lee, and cookies that the neighborhood children had helped bake. "Dad," she said, watching him teach Amy's friend how to properly water an indoor plant, "I wish Mom could see this. She always said you had so much love to give." Mr. Chen paused, touching the wedding ring he still wore. "She does see it," he replied softly. "Every time these children laugh in our garden, every time we share a meal at her table, she's here." The city council's initiative gained momentum. Other neighborhoods began reporting success stories similar to Mr. Chen's. The police department's community program expanded, with officers Rodriguez and Thompson training other officers in community engagement. They always used Mr. Chen's story as an example of how small acts of kindness could spark massive change. Mrs. Zhang started a blog documenting their community's journey, sharing recipes from their weekly dinners and gardening tips from Mr. Chen's classes. The blog caught the attention of a local television station, which wanted to feature their story in a documentary about combating elderly isolation. At first, Mr. Chen hesitated about the television coverage. "I'm just an old man who learned to open his door again," he told Mrs. Zhang. But Amy, with her usual wisdom, saw it differently. "You're not just an old man," she insisted. "You're our Mr. Chen, and your story might help other old men open their doors too." The documentary crew spent several days filming the community in action. They captured the gardening classes, now moved into a small greenhouse the neighbors had helped build. They filmed the weekly dinners, where dishes from different cultures shared space on the table. Most importantly, they recorded the genuine connections that had formed between generations. One particularly touching moment came when they filmed Mr. Chen teaching Amy's class about plant life cycles. Using his wife's old botany books and simple demonstrations, he showed the children how seeds transformed into plants. "Just like these seeds," he told them, "sometimes people need the right conditions to grow and bloom. Sometimes they need someone to water them with kindness and warm them with love." The documentary's premiere at the local community center brought together people from all corners of the city. Mr. Chen sat in the front row, surrounded by his newfound family, Amy bouncing excitedly beside him, Mrs. Zhang holding his hand supportively, and dozens of neighbors who had become dear friends over the past months. As the lights dimmed and the film began, Mr. Chen watched his own transformation unfold on screen. The cameras had captured moments he hadn't even realized were significant, the way his eyes crinkled with joy while teaching children about plants, the gentle patience in his hands as he demonstrated proper pruning techniques, and the subtle changes in his posture as he grew more confident in community gatherings. As the lights dimmed and the film began, Mr. Chen watched his own transformation unfold on screen. The cameras had captured moments he hadn't even realized were significant, the way his eyes crinkled with joy while teaching children about plants, the gentle patience in his hands as he demonstrated proper pruning techniques, and the subtle changes in his posture as he grew more confident in community gatherings. The documentary revealed something else too, the ripple effects of his story across the city. It showed how Mrs. Robinson, the retired teacher from the city council meeting, had started a similar program in her neighborhood. Her story paralleled his own, from isolation to connection, from loneliness to purpose. "Look, Mr. Chen," Amy whispered during one scene, "that's when you taught us about the butterfly garden." The footage showed them planting flowers specifically chosen to attract butterflies, Mr. Chen explaining how each plant played a role in the local ecosystem. The children's faces lit up with wonder as he described the monarch butterfly's incredible journey. After the screening, people lined up to share their stories with Mr. Chen. A young couple talked about how they'd started visiting their elderly neighbor after hearing about his community program. A retired firefighter admitted he'd been living in isolation until he saw Mr. Chen speak at the city council meeting. But the most touching moment came when a group of social workers approached him. They had been struggling to engage elderly residents in their programs, and Mr. Chen's story had shown them a new approach. It's not about creating programs for seniors, one social worker realized, it's about creating connections between people. The success of the documentary led to unexpected opportunities. Universities reached out, wanting to study the community program as a model for addressing elderly isolation. Mr. Chen found himself hosting researchers who documented every aspect of their neighborhood's transformation. One morning, while tending to his indoor plants during the winter chill, Mr. Chen received a surprising call. His son, who had been too busy with work to visit for years, had watched the documentary online. "Dad," his voice cracked with emotion, "I had no idea. I'm booking a flight home next week." The news of his son's visit spread quickly through the neighborhood. Mrs. Zhang immediately began planning a special welcome dinner, while Amy insisted on creating a presentation of all the garden projects they'd completed. The community rallied together, eager to show Mr. Chen's son how his father had touched their lives. When his son arrived, the changes in the house struck him immediately. Photos of community events hung alongside family pictures. The garden, even in winter, showed signs of careful tending and future plans. But the biggest change was in his father, the way he carried himself, the confidence in his voice, the light in his eyes. "You've built something remarkable here, Dad," his son said during their first dinner together, watching as neighbors dropped by with desserts and well wishes. "I'm sorry I wasn't here to see it happen." Mr. Chen smiled, passing him a plate of Mrs. Li's famous almond cookies. "You're here now," he replied, "and that's what matters." The visit sparked honest conversations between father and son. They talked about the years of distance, the missed opportunities, and their shared grief over losing Mrs. Chen. But they also talked about the future, making plans for regular visits and video calls. His son even joined one of the gardening classes, laughing as Amy taught him the proper way to transplant seedlings. As winter deepened, the community adapted their activities. The gardening classes moved entirely indoors, focusing on houseplants and planning for spring. Mr. Chen taught everyone about forcing bulbs to bloom indoors, bringing color to the gray winter days. The weekly dinners became even more important, offering warmth and connection during the cold months. The police department's community program continued to expand, with officers Rodriguez and Thompson regularly bringing new officers to observe their neighborhood success. "It's not just about checking on seniors," Officer Rodriguez explained to her colleagues. "It's about creating an environment where everyone looks out for each other." One snowy evening, as Mr. Chen sat in his favorite chair watching the neighborhood children build snowmen in his front yard, he found himself writing in the journal Officer Thompson had given him. His entries had evolved from simple gardening notes to deeper reflections on community, connection, and growth. "Today," he wrote, "I realized that loneliness is like a winter garden. It might seem lifeless on the surface, but beneath the frost, there's always the potential for new growth. Sometimes it just takes a child's innocent question, a neighbor's kindness, or a community's love to help that growth begin." The success of their neighborhood's transformation began attracting attention from other cities. Municipal leaders from nearby towns visited to learn how they could implement similar programs. Each time, Mr. Chen emphasized that it wasn't about creating perfect programs or following exact steps, it was about opening hearts and doors, one person at a time. Spring arrived early that year, bringing with it new beginnings for Mr. Chen and his community. The first warm day found him in his garden, surrounded by eager helpers of all ages, preparing the soil for a special project. The city had been so impressed with their community program that they'd granted funding to expand his backyard garden into a full-fledged community space. "Mr. Chen, where should we plant the new vegetable beds?" Amy called out, now confident in her role as his assistant garden coordinator. She'd grown taller over the months, but her enthusiasm remained as bright as ever. The garden expansion was partly her idea. She'd suggested that they could grow fresh vegetables for the community food bank. The transformation of his backyard began on a Saturday morning when neighbors from across the city arrived with tools, seedlings, and endless enthusiasm. Mr. Chen watched in amazement as his modest garden evolved into something greater. Raised beds for vegetables took shape along the sunny fence line, while a small pond emerged in a shady corner. "Your wife would have loved this," Mrs. Zhang said softly, standing beside him as they watched volunteers install a wheelchair-accessible pathway through the garden. Mr. Chen nodded, touching the wedding ring he still wore. "She always said gardens were meant to be shared," he replied, his voice warm with memory. The community garden project caught the attention of a national magazine focused on urban renewal. When the reporter arrived to interview Mr. Chen, she found him teaching a group of seniors from a nearby retirement home how to start their own container gardens. The sight of elderly residents finding new purpose through gardening moved her to tears. "It's not just about the plants," Mr. Chen explained to the reporter as they walked through the expanding garden. "It's about giving people roots in their community, helping them bloom where they're planted." He shared how the garden had become a place of healing for many, where grieving widows found comfort in nurturing new life, where isolated seniors discovered friendship among the flowers, and where children learned patience and care. The article's publication brought unexpected attention. Government officials from other states began reaching out, interested in replicating their community model. Mr. Chen found himself hosting video conferences, sharing his experience with community leaders across the country. Amy insisted on being his technical support, making sure he never forgot to unmute himself during calls. One morning, while Mr. Chen was teaching a group about companion planting, a familiar face appeared at the garden gate. It was Mrs. Robinson, the retired teacher from the city council meeting, but she wasn't alone. With her was a group of seniors and children from her neighborhood, eager to see the garden they'd heard so much about. "We've started something similar in our area," Mrs. Robinson explained, her eyes bright with excitement. "But we wanted to learn from the original." The visit turned into an impromptu garden festival, with Mr. Chen's community sharing tips, stories, and even seedlings with their guests. The success of the garden led to new initiatives. Local schools began incorporating garden-based learning into their curricula, with Mr. Chen serving as a special advisor. Children would visit weekly, learning about science, math, and environmental responsibility through hands-on gardening experiences. Officers Rodriguez and Thompson, who had become regular fixtures in the garden, helped establish a network of similar community gardens across the city. They understood that these spaces were about more than just growing plants, they were about growing connections between people. Mr. Chen's daughter and son, seeing the impact their father was having, decided to become more involved. They started alternating their visits, ensuring one of them could be present for major garden events. His son even began working remotely 1 week each month, allowing him to spend more time with his father and the community. The weekly community dinners evolved too. They now featured vegetables fresh from the garden, creating a farm-to-table experience that brought even more neighbors together. Mr. Chen's dining room could no longer contain the gatherings, so they often spilled out into the garden, where tables and chairs would be set up among the blooming flowers. One evening, as the community gathered for dinner under the stars, Amy presented Mr. Chen with a special gift. She and her friends had created a scrapbook documenting the garden's journey, from its humble beginnings as his private sanctuary to its current status as a thriving community hub. "Look," she said, pointing to a photo of his birthday dinner from months ago, "this is where it all started." Mr. Chen felt tears well up in his eyes as he turned the pages, seeing how one small act of kindness had grown into something so magnificent. The police department's community program had become a model for departments nationwide. Officers Rodriguez and Thompson were frequently invited to speak at conferences, always insisting that Mr. Chen join them virtually to share his perspective. His simple message about the importance of human connection resonated with audiences everywhere. As spring bloomed fully, Mr. Chen received news that would take their community project to an even higher level. A national foundation focused on aging and community building wanted to establish a training center in their city, using their garden as a living classroom for communities wanting to start similar programs. "You see," Amy said wisely, helping him plant new roses near the garden entrance, "your garden isn't just growing flowers anymore. It's growing happiness all over the country." Mr. Chen smiled, realizing that this wise little girl who had started it all with a simple birthday invitation had grown wise beyond her years. Summer arrived with an unexpected letter that brought tears to Mr. Chen's eyes. The National Council on Aging had chosen him as their Community Builder of the Year. The award ceremony would be held in the state capital, and they wanted him to deliver a keynote speech about his journey from isolation to community leadership. The news spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Mrs. Zhang immediately began planning group transportation to the ceremony, while Amy appointed herself as his speech-writing assistant. "Remember to tell them about the butterflies," she insisted, referring to their garden's popular butterfly sanctuary. "And don't forget about the birthday dinner that started everything." As Mr. Chen prepared for the ceremony, he noticed subtle changes in his community. The initial excitement of their project had matured into something deeper and more sustainable. Neighbors who had once been strangers now looked after each other like family. Children who had started in his garden classes were now teaching younger kids about plants and nature. One afternoon, while working in the garden, Mr. Chen overheard a conversation that touched his heart. A new family had moved into the neighborhood, and within hours, several neighbors had visited them, bringing food and invitations to the weekly community dinner. The natural way his community now reached out to others showed how much they'd all grown. The day before the award ceremony, Mr. Chen received another surprise. His children had arranged for his sister to fly in from overseas, someone he hadn't seen in person for over a decade. When she arrived, she could hardly believe the transformation in both her brother and his home. "Little brother," she said in their native language, watching children play in the garden he'd once tended alone, "you've built something beautiful here." Her presence completed a circle of healing he hadn't even realized needed closing. The award ceremony itself was a community affair. 3 buses filled with neighbors made the journey to the state capital. Amy insisted on sitting next to Mr. Chen, helping him practice his speech one last time. Mrs. Zhang had coordinated with other neighbors to bring dishes representing their community's diversity for the post-ceremony reception. Standing at the podium, Mr. Chen felt surprisingly calm. Looking out at the audience, he saw not just faces, but stories, his own story reflected in hundreds of others who understood the pain of isolation and the healing power of community. He spoke from his heart, sharing how a child's innocent question about a birthday dinner had cracked open the shell of his loneliness. "In my garden," he said, his voice clear and strong, "we grow more than plants. We grow understanding between generations. We grow friendships across cultural boundaries. We grow the knowledge that no one needs to be alone." The audience listened in rapt attention as he described how their community had evolved from a simple dinner invitation to a model for national change. After the ceremony, something unexpected happened. People from different cities approached him, not just to congratulate him, but to share their own stories of transformation. A woman from a small town described how she'd started a similar program after seeing his documentary. A young police officer shared how their community program had inspired him to create a youth gardening initiative in a struggling neighborhood. Back home, the community celebrated their founder's recognition with a special dinner in the garden. Tables weaved between the flower beds, and lights twinkled in the trees. Mr. Chen's sister, watching him interact with his neighbors, remarked how he reminded her of their father, a community elder who had always put others first. The national recognition brought new opportunities and challenges. Universities wanted to study their community model, and delegations from other countries expressed interest in learning from their experience. Mr. Chen worried about maintaining the intimate, personal nature of their community while sharing their story with the world. It was Amy, once again, who offered the wisdom they needed. "Mr. Chen," she said, helping him water the roses one evening, "remember when you taught us about plant cuttings? How one plant can become many plants, but each one is still special. That's like our community. We can share it with others, and each new place will make it their own special thing." The garden continued to evolve. A new section was dedicated to teaching sustainable farming practices. Local chefs began partnering with them to create farm-to-table programs that benefited local food banks. The police department's community program expanded to include agricultural therapy for at-risk youth. One particularly meaningful project emerged when a group of recent immigrants joined their garden community. Many were elderly individuals who felt isolated in their new country. In the garden, they found not just a connection to their new home but an opportunity to share their own agricultural knowledge and cultural traditions. Mr. Chen's journal, which had started as a simple garden notebook, had grown into a collection of community wisdom. Officers Rodriguez and Thompson helped him digitize it, creating an online resource for other communities looking to start similar programs. The journal included not just gardening advice but insights about building connections across generations and cultures. As summer progressed, Mr. Chen's sister extended her stay, not wanting to leave the vibrant community she'd discovered. She began teaching traditional cooking classes in Mr. Chen's kitchen, adding another layer to their weekly community dinners. The siblings found themselves healing old wounds through their shared service to others. During one warm evening, as fireflies began to appear in the garden, Mr. Chen sat with Amy on his porch swing. "Did you know," he asked her, "that when you invited me to share my birthday dinner, you were planting a seed?" Amy looked up at him questioningly. "That seed grew into all of this," he gestured to the garden where neighbors were gathering for their evening activities. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness grow into the biggest gardens of joy. As autumn returned, marking a full year since that first birthday dinner, Mr. Chen's community prepared for a special celebration. They wanted to honor not just his birthday, but the incredible journey they'd all taken together. The garden, now in its fall splendor, provided the perfect setting for reflection and gratitude. The morning of the celebration, Mr. Chen woke early to find Amy and her mother already in his garden. They were setting up photos along the pathways, a timeline of their community's growth. Each image told a story: the first birthday dinner, the day the police officers arrived, the beginning of the garden classes, the award ceremony, and countless moments of connection in between. "Look what we found," Amy called out, holding up a slightly wrinkled birthday card covered in glitter, the very first one she'd made him. Mr. Chen touched it gently, remembering how that simple card had marked the beginning of his transformation from a lonely widower to a beloved community elder. Throughout the day, people began arriving with dishes for the celebration. But they brought more than just food, they carried with them stories of how the community had changed their lives. Mrs. Robinson, now a regular visitor, brought seniors from 3 other neighborhoods where similar programs had taken root. Officer Rodriguez and Thompson arrived with news that their community policing model had been adopted by departments in 5 different states. Mr. Chen's children and sister had worked together to create a surprise. They'd collected video messages from people across the country who had been inspired by their story. The messages played on a screen set up in the garden: teachers who had started school gardens, police officers who had initiated community programs, elderly individuals who had found new purpose in their own neighborhoods. As evening approached, the garden glowed with string lights and paper lanterns. Tables weaved between the flower beds, laden with dishes that represented the diversity of their community. Mr. Chen's sister's dumplings sat next to Mrs. Patel's curry, Mrs. Zhang's noodles, and dozens of other dishes that told the story of their multicultural family. Standing in the center of it all, Mr. Chen felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had grown from that first simple dinner. Amy tugged at his sleeve, pointing to a newly installed bench near the butterfly garden. A small plaque read, "The birthday bench, where friendship blooms and loneliness ends." Dedicated to Mr. Chen, who taught us that every garden needs both roots and wings. The community gathered around as Mr. Chen prepared to make a speech. But before he could begin, Amy stepped forward with an announcement. "We have one more surprise," she said, her voice carrying across the garden. She revealed that the community had worked with the city to officially name their garden program, Chen's Garden of Connection, ensuring his legacy would continue to inspire future generations. Fighting back tears, Mr. Chen looked at the faces around him, the police officers who had become family, the neighbors who had become friends, the children who had become gardeners, and most importantly, little Amy, who had first opened her heart to a lonely old man. "A year ago," he began, his voice soft but clear, "I thought I was too old to start a new chapter in life. I thought my story was ending. But what I've learned is that as long as we have love to give and kindness to share, our story never really ends, it just grows in new directions." He spoke about how their community had proven that age is no barrier to new beginnings, that cultural differences can become bridges instead of walls, and that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can trigger the biggest changes. "In this garden," he said, gesturing to the thriving space around them, "we've grown something more precious than flowers or vegetables. We've grown hope." The celebration continued into the night, with generations mixing freely. Children showed seniors how to take selfies, while elderly community members taught young ones traditional games from their cultures. Mr. Chen's sister led an impromptu dance lesson, teaching everyone traditional dances from their childhood. Later that evening, as the party wound down, Mr. Chen found himself sitting on the birthday bench with Amy. "Did you know," she asked, her voice thoughtful, "that when I invited you to dinner that day, I was kind of lonely too? Mom worked a lot, and I didn't have many friends. But now look, we have the biggest family in the whole city." Her words struck a deep chord in Mr. Chen's heart. What had started as a solution to one person's loneliness had grown into a cure for many. The garden had become more than just a place, it was a living symbol of how community could heal, how connections could grow, and how love could multiply when shared. As the last guests departed, leaving the garden peaceful under the stars, Mr. Chen took out his journal. He had one more entry to write. "Today, I celebrated not just another year of life, but the rebirth of hope. In this garden, we've proven that it's never too late to bloom, never too late to grow, and never too late to make a difference in someone else's life." The next morning, as he tended to the autumn flowers, Mr. Chen thought about how his late wife would have loved all of this. He could almost hear her laughing with the children, teaching them about plants just as he did now. In a way, her spirit lived on in every flower that bloomed, every friendship that grew, and every life that was touched by their garden of connection. And as he watched the sun rise over his garden, now alive with the promise of another day of growth and connection, Mr. Chen understood that his story wasn't just about how a community saved one lonely old man, it was about how that man's willingness to open his door, share his table, and tend his garden had helped create a blueprint for building bridges between hearts, homes, and generations.